The fact is that we have a system in this country where voting in all too many places still benefits and favors older voters over young, white voters over black, and in many places, frankly, male voters over women. So there is a lot of discrimination built into our voting systems that remains, and it is shameful to see that as these cases go to court, this right-wing ecosystem continues to expand and that the Republican Party continues to lead the way.
Wow. Daryl?
Wow. And, Congressman, and listening to what Attorney Elias lays out there when we're talking about absentee ballots, it's so odd because, the rules just seem to change state by state and how it becomes more difficult. In some states, there's the exact name match that they have going on. And in some states, there's voter identification that's got to accompany absentee ballots. And some states, there are different receive by dates when the absentee ballot has to be received. I know you've been working on the Freedom to Vote Act. How would that address any of these issues that Mr. Elias has been raising?
Well, Daryl, the goal of the Freedom to Vote Act is to create, as I said, a floor, a set of uniform standards that apply in every state. So you don't have this hodgepodge across the country, which, as frustrating as it is to the people that are feeling this voter suppression, I think there's just a general frustration in the country that we don't have some basic rules that apply everywhere. That if you're in this state and you look to your left or your right to states around you, there's no sense that there's kind of a shared commitment to some basic principles about how you access the ballot box. So the Freedom to Vote Act, the sections of that bill which are focused on ballot access, and by the way, that part of the bill was largely written by John Lewis. It's what he introduced for years as the Voter Empowerment Act, and that's exactly what it does. It empowers voters. But that puts in a whole set of uniform standards. So, for example, what you were just talking about, there would be a vote by mail option in every state in America. There would be 2 weeks of early voting provided to every voter in America. There would be nationwide automatic online and same-day voter registration to make it easier for people to get on the rolls so that when they show up to vote, everything's taken care of and they can cast their vote. It would have a standard where no voter in the country has to wait longer than 30 minutes to vote, because we know that in some places you can walk in, it takes you 5 minutes. But in too many places, people are standing in line for hours on end, again, just trying to exercise their basic right in a democracy, in American democracy. It would push back against these voter purges. It would create uniform standards on voter ID so that you can use a whole menu of documentation to support it. They can't just say, you only have 3 kinds of documents you can present. No, an expansive list that you can use to demonstrate who you are. And so there's not this kind of pernicious obstacle to people voting that we've seen in some states. And those are just some of the examples, Daryl, of how you create a set of basic uniform standards. And by the way, these are things that the average voter would say are no-brainers, regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum. These are things that you want to know when you, like I said, get up on the day you're going to go vote. You want to know that these kind of basic protections and opportunities are in place. So that's the goal. And the Freedom to Vote Act, led with John Lewis's contribution in Title I of that bill on voter empowerment, is the legislation that can help ensure that we have these basic protections in place. It doesn't mean we're not going to need Marc Elias and the courts going forward. We're going to absolutely need them to put out the fires. And frankly, when we get these standards in place, to make sure that those standards are being respected in every state in the nation. But that's why this is a tag team operation. Do the work in the courts, make sure that the litigation side of this effort is as strong as it can possibly be. Mark's leading that effort in many ways, and at the same time create federal legislation that goes across the whole country and says every American who wants to cast their vote should be able to do that without having to run an obstacle course.
Absolutely. And Mark, I'm looking at, the report, and I just want you to talk to people about some of the amazing findings of that report some more. 73 from January 1 to December 31st, 73 new democracy-related lawsuits were filed across 31 states, 146 court orders that impacted voters across 34 states, 83 victories for voters across 26 states. Tell us more about what all that really means for those of us who sit in this world, wanting to just, make sure that we can vote for the people who we care about. What are some of the themes, some of the subjects underneath all of those case statistics? Because they're shocking just in the pervasiveness of them, not to mention the impact on voters. Tell us.
Yeah, so I think your last point is right, which is we always should center ourselves around the voters, because voting laws exist to help voters vote and to ensure that we have free and fair elections. And let me start by echoing something that the Congressman said. When the Freedom to Vote Act was put before Congress, I said many times that it is the single most important piece of legislation of my lifetime, and that that the courts are not the answer to saving democracy. They are a stopgap, but that we need Congress to enact the Freedom to Vote Act, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, and I think it's important to recognize that every Democrat in the Congress voted for it, and not a single Republican did, despite all of the efforts that the Congressman and his colleagues made to convince them that democracy is a nonpartisan issue. And what we saw in the courtroom following the failure of the bill to overcome the filibuster in the Senate, what we saw was an all-out assault on democracy. Across the board. We saw litigation that focused on election administration, on voter registration, on mail-in voting, in-person voting, post-election cases. Carrie Lake is still litigating the fact that she lost the governor's race in 2022. She's not running for Senate. She's still litigating the governor's race. And we saw a continued emphasis by conservatives and Republican legislatures to perpetuate the wrong-headed, frankly, racist policy of disenfranchising people who have served their sentences, and so rather than welcoming them back into the community as the vast majority of Americans support, when this was put on the ballot in Florida, as not exactly a left-wing bastion of a state, it got two-thirds of the vote. So we continue to see litigation across a variety of these topics, but all of them boil down to the same thing, which is that that there is an industry on the right among conservatives funded by their millionaires and billionaires to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. The harder to vote part is they want to make it harder, particularly for minority and young voters to vote. They enact legislation. Barbara, you and I mentioned at the outset, you and I go back to 2013. When North Carolina targeted African American voters with near surgical precision. Those are the words. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. Yeah. And that's what they were up to in 2013. It's now 11 years later, and it hasn't gotten better. It's gotten worse, right? They are now targeting. They are using new computer technology and other data and analytics to target Black, brown, and young voters everywhere they can, and to litigate against free and fair elections where they can. In Arizona, I wrote recently for Democracy Docket. In Arizona, over a 10-day period, we saw 3 lawsuits filed by conservative organizations to try to undo the nonpartisan rule book for how elections are conducted in Arizona, called the Election Procedure Manual. Now, why would Republicans want to undo the Election Procedure Manual when it's just a how-to for running elections at the local level? Well, number one, because they want to sow chaos. Number two, they want to allow things like voter harassment and intimidation at the polls. Literally, one of the lawsuits seeks to strike down the provisions that prevent that. And then number three, because they know that if everyone's allowed to vote, their preferred candidates won't win. They also want to be able to engage in a pernicious effort to cast doubt on the legitimacy of elections, which we saw after 2020 and we continue to see today. I'll end with one other statistic that I was struck by the other day in a Pew poll that just came out. Only 28% of registered Republicans believe that there ought to be no excuse mail-in voting. Now, Barbara, you and I and the Congressman and Daryl, we all go back long enough to remember when no excuse vote by mail was a bipartisan consensus. There was no lobby against that. That was just viewed as a good thing. And the idea that now, after 4 and 5 years of being lied to, so many Republicans now don't believe in that is really a very sad commentary and a real threat to the future of democracy.
Absolutely. Daryl?
Yeah, one of the things, Congressman, that Mark laid out was dealing with, and Barbara knew as soon as Marc Elias touched on Florida and voter disenfranchisement, what was going to happen from me. One of the things that he lays out is what happens with people that are formally convicted of a felony and returning citizens, and whether or not they're able to vote. It looks like to me intentional confusion that is put in place in different states, whether it's Florida or Alabama or heaven forbid Mississippi. So one of the things I'm hoping that you would be able to lay out to our listeners today. Number one is, how would the Freedom to Vote Act address that? And, Mark also talked about the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. How is that, we know it, but we want to be certain our listeners understand, how is that different than the Freedom to Vote Act, and are both needed, and why?
Yeah. Well, on the first question, in terms of returning citizens and voting restoration, one of the provisions that's included within the Freedom to Vote Act would provide for that right on a national basis. Again, we've seen how in states, even like a Florida, the public is there. They recognize that this is an important right that ought to be restored to returning citizens and voted for that. Now, Florida to make it complicated and get in the way and put some barriers to that being an easy process, obviously, and that's something that has to be taken on in the courts, as Mark indicated. But we very much viewed that from the beginning as an important standard to bring into the national legislation, into the Freedom to Vote Act, so that opportunity is there across the country and that there's standards in place to make sure that it can't be gamed or interfered with at the state level. So that's a part of the bill that we're very proud of. It's the result, as frankly most of the provisions in the Freedom to Vote Act are, of constituents, voters, people out there in the country expressing their concerns to members of Congress, who then developed pieces of legislation that we could incorporate into this large, overarching, transformative package of democracy reforms. So a very critical component. Now, when you get to the kind of relationship between the Freedom to Vote Act on the one hand and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act on the other hand, they work together hand in glove. They're mutually reinforcing. Rights Advancement Act is what would reauthorize and strengthen the original 1965 Voting Rights Act. Let me just point out, since